The old woman did not ask for custody at first. That was what Judith Sheindlin noticed before anyone else in the room noticed anything. Not the worn black handbag clutched against the grandmother's knees. Not the young mother sitting beside her lawyer with both hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Not the little boy in the hallway outside, swinging his feet above the scuffed courthouse floor, waiting for adults to decide which home would smell like dinner that night. The grandmother did not ask to win. She asked for Sunday, one more Sunday. It was the kind of request that sounded too small for a courtroom. Judges dealt in orders, petitions, findings, rights, responsibilities. They dealt in who had failed, who had returned, who had standing, who had the law on their side. But this woman, somewhere in her late 60s, with silver hair pinned neatly at the back of her head and a coat that had been brushed carefully before she came downtown, kept returning to the same sentence. Your Honor, I just want him to know he can still come on Sundays. There are cases that announce themselves with shouting. There are cases that arrive with bruises, police reports, school notes, emergency motions, and accusations sharp enough to cut through the air. And then there are the quieter ones, the ones that walk into court carrying a lunch receipt, a small photograph, and a lifetime of ordinary days. This was one of those. By the mid-1980s, Judith Sheindlin had already seen more family sorrow than most people could hold in one lifetime. Long before the lace collar, long before the afternoon television glare, long before America tuned in to hear her cut through excuses with a look, she was in Manhattan Family Court, where the endings of families were written in ink and filed before lunch. She had been a prosecutor in the family court system. She had seen mothers disappear, fathers vanish, children lie for love, grandparents step forward because someone had to. She had learned that neglect rarely arrived wearing a name tag. It came as missed appointments, empty refrigerators, school absences, babies left too long in borrowed rooms, and children who stopped asking when someone was coming back. By then, she also understood something the law did not always know how to say. A child does not measure family by biology first. A child measures family by who opens the door. That was the central wound sitting in front of her that afternoon. The biological mother had returned. She was not the woman she had been 3 years earlier. She had a job now. She had a clean apartment in Queens. She had letters from a counselor, a church friend, and an employer who wrote that she arrived early and stayed late. She had done what the system always said it wanted parents to do. She had stabilized. She had come back. And the grandmother had stayed. She had stayed through the fevers, through the first day of school, through the night the boy cried because another child said he had no real mother. Through the morning he asked whether people could forget you the way they forgot umbrellas on buses. She had stayed with oatmeal, pressed shirts, library books, and those ordinary Sunday suppers that children remember long after they forget what anyone said in court. The law could see the mother's progress. Judith could see that, but she could also see the grandmother's hands. They were folded on top of the handbag as though she were holding herself together by force. Not dramatic hands, not begging hands, working hands, hands that had buttoned a small coat, taken a temperature, braided a shoelace after one had snapped, wiped milk from a kitchen table, signed school forms where a parent's name was supposed to be. The young mother was crying quietly now, not loudly, not for effect. Her face had the exhausted look of a woman who knew everyone in the room remembered the worst thing she had ever been. And perhaps that was the cruelty of family court. It did not meet people only as they were. It met them carrying the version of themselves that had once failed a child. Judith had no patience for performance. She had no patience for self-pity dressed as reform. But she could recognize real shame when it walked in and sat down without trying to decorate itself. The mother did not deny the past. She said she had been young. She said she had been lost. She said there had been a man, then another man, then pills, then mornings she could not remember clearly enough to defend herself. She said her mother had taken the boy because someone had to. She said it with the terrible honesty of a woman who knew gratitude and resentment could live in the same mouth. I know what she did, the mother said. I know I should thank her every day. Then she looked down. But he's my son. There it was, 4 words strong enough to move a legal system. But across from her sat another sentence, softer and older and harder to file. He asks for me when he wakes up. Judith Sheindlin closed her eyes for 1 second longer than usual. Not long enough for anyone in the room to call it emotion. Long enough only for herself to know that something inside the case had shifted. This was not a fight between a villain and a hero. It would have been easier if it had been. It was a fight between blood and memory. And the child belonged to both. The file said the boy was 7. 7 is old enough to remember, and young enough to be punished by what grown people call a fresh start. Judith knew that age. She had raised children of her own while building a career in rooms that were not built for women who intended to be heard. She had left her own house in the morning with the practiced discipline of a working mother who understood that breakfast, school clothes, clients, courtrooms, and guilt all had to be managed before noon. She knew what it meant to be needed in 2 places at once. She knew what it meant to be judged by people who never saw the private arithmetic of a woman's day. But this case did not let her hide behind toughness. The mother's lawyer kept returning to the proper language: reunification, parental rights, successful treatment, stable housing. The words were clean. The facts were organized. The petition was not unreasonable. The mother had done the work, and the court had to take that seriously. The grandmother's side had fewer formal words. She had dates. The day he first said Nana, the winter pneumonia, the first school picture where he refused to smile unless she stood behind the photographer, the Sunday routine, church in the morning, roast chicken if she could afford it, spaghetti if she could not, then the park when the weather allowed, then homework at the kitchen table while the radio played softly. No statute could hold all of that. Still, Judith could not simply rule from tenderness. That was the burden the public never understood about judges. A judge may feel the human weight of a case. A judge may see the trembling lip, the old hands, the child looking toward the familiar coat in the hallway. But feeling is not an order. Compassion is not a legal standard. And if she let emotion alone govern one case, she would destroy the fairness of the next. That was the loneliness of the bench. People thought power meant doing what you wanted. Sometimes power meant not doing what your heart begged you to do. The boy was brought in privately for a short interview, as children sometimes were when adults had made the truth too heavy for open court. He was small for 7, with a serious face and socks that had slipped down around his ankles. He did not look like a child entering a grand legal proceeding. He looked like a child who had been told to be polite in a building where everyone whispered. Judith softened her voice, though not her eyes. Children could smell dishonesty faster than adults could. They knew when they were being handled. They knew when grown-ups used sweet voices to hide bad news. She asked him about school. He answered. She asked him about his room. He told her where his toy cars were kept. She asked him what he liked on Sundays. That was when his face changed. Not much, just enough. He said his grandmother let him stir the sauce. He said she put a towel on the chair so he could stand high enough. He said his mother had come over twice and cried in the kitchen. He said he did not like when adults cried, because then he felt he had to choose who to make happy. There are sentences children say without knowing they have just opened the entire case. That was one of them. Judith heard the boy's loyalty, not preference, not strategy, loyalty. Children in broken families often become tiny diplomats. They study faces, they measure tones, they learn that loving one adult can look like betrayal to another. By 7, this boy had already learned the emotional labor of a grown man. When he left the room, Judith sat still. Years later, America would know her as the woman who interrupted nonsense before it got comfortable. They would laugh when she told people not to urinate on her leg and tell her it was raining. They would admire the speed of her mind, the precision of her instincts, the way she could strip a lie down to its bones in 30 seconds. But in family court, speed did not always help. Some truths could not be cross-examined into neatness. Back in the courtroom, the young mother looked younger than she had when the hearing began. Her makeup had faded, her posture had fallen. The grandmother looked smaller too, as if waiting had removed years from her strength rather than adding them. Their pain had begun to resemble each other. That was the part no one wanted to admit. They both loved the child. They both feared losing him. They both believed the other woman held a part of him that should have belonged to them. Judith asked the mother one question that made the room go quiet. Can you love him enough to let him keep what saved him? The mother's lawyer shifted. The grandmother's eyes lifted. The mother did not answer immediately. Outside the courtroom, someone coughed. A cart rolled somewhere in the hallway. The city went on being the city, indifferent to one family's breaking point. The mother finally whispered, "I don't want to erase her." Judith leaned back. That mattered. Not because it solved everything, it did not, but because it showed the difference between a parent who wanted a child back as proof of recovery and a parent who wanted the child whole. The difference was everything. Then Judith turned to the grandmother. "And can you love him enough to let his mother become real to him again?" The old woman's hands tightened around the handbag. For a moment, no one breathed, because that was the other half of the truth. Grandparents who rescue children are often praised until the day they are asked to step back. Then the praise becomes paperwork. The sacrifice becomes history. The person who gave the child a home is told to become a visitor in it. The grandmother swallowed hard. "I can try," she said. It was not a beautiful answer. It was better than beautiful. It was honest. Judith looked down at the file. She could feel the order forming. Imperfect, because every order in a case like this was imperfect. The mother would regain primary custody gradually. Not overnight. Not as a victory march. There would be transitional visits, counseling, school monitoring, and, if she had anything to say about it, the grandmother would not be treated as a leftover from a bad chapter. The law could restore a mother's rights, but the law could not pretend the boy's Sundays had never happened. That became the line Judith carried out of the room. The law could open a door, but it could not decide who had been waiting behind it. That evening, after the courthouse had emptied into the ordinary noise of Manhattan, Judith sat alone for a few minutes before going home. The file was closed, but the case was not gone. That was the secret most people never understood about her years before television. A judge could leave the building. A judge could take off the robe. A judge could ride home, answer the phone, make dinner plans, ask about homework, sit across from a husband, laugh at something small. But the cases had a way of following quietly, like shadows at the edge of a room. This one followed her because there had been no clean villain. The grandmother was not wrong. The mother was not wrong to want her son. The child was not wrong to need both. And Judith knew that the hardest cases were often the ones where everyone had a claim on love. At home, the world was softer. There were the familiar sounds of family, the private rhythm that did not belong to any courtroom. But even there, she may have thought of the old woman's request. One more Sunday, not a fortune, not revenge, not even the final say. Just one more Sunday in the kitchen, with a child standing on a towel-covered chair, stirring sauce as though the whole world could be held together by the smell of garlic and tomatoes. Years later, when America watched Judge Judy from living rooms, kitchens, hospital beds, sewing rooms, and quiet apartments, they saw certainty. They saw the finger point. They saw the famous glare. They saw a woman who did not suffer fools, who did not excuse laziness, who demanded facts and hated lies. They loved her for it because she said what many of them had spent a lifetime being too polite to say. But certainty on television was only one piece of Judith Sheindlin. Before the cameras, before the applause, before she became a fixture in the afternoon light of American homes, she had spent years in rooms where certainty was rare. She had learned that people could be guilty and wounded at the same time. She had learned that a woman could fail as a mother and still fight her way back. She had learned that a grandmother could save a child and still have to loosen her grip. She had learned that law was necessary, but law alone was never enough to explain a family. That is what the public sometimes missed. Her toughness did not come from a lack of feeling. It came from knowing feeling could not be allowed to lie. The grandmother's case was not famous. There were no cameras, no audience, no headline. No one repeated it on television for laughs. It was just another family court matter in a city full of them. A small boy, a returning mother, an old woman asking not to be erased. But perhaps that is why it mattered. Because legacy is not only built in the moments everyone sees. Sometimes it is built in the forgotten rooms, in the decisions that never become history, in the quiet discipline of trying to do right when every answer hurts somebody. That afternoon did not make Judith Sheindlin softer. It made her sharper about softness. It reminded her that love can become possessive. Recovery can become selfish. Sacrifice can become control. And sometimes the most merciful thing a judge can do is refuse to let any adult turn a child into evidence of their own suffering. The boy needed his mother. He needed his grandmother. He needed Sundays not as a prize, but as a bridge. And Judith, with all her bluntness and all her discipline, understood that a bridge is sometimes the closest thing a courtroom can build to mercy. The law could open a door, but it could not decide who had been waiting behind it. That line stayed because it belonged to more than one case. It belonged to the woman herself. To Judith, who walked through doors men had not expected her to open. To the mother, who wanted a second chance. To the grandmother who had waited behind a kitchen door every Sunday. To every viewer who would one day see Judge Judy on television and think toughness meant she never carried pain home. She carried it. She simply knew where to put it. And maybe that was the real secret behind the woman America trusted for 25 years. She was not unforgiving. She was careful. Careful with truth. Careful with children. Careful with the fragile difference between what the law permits and what the heart remembers. So when people remember Judge Judy, they may remember the robe, the lace collar, the pearls, the quick temper, the quicker mind. But somewhere behind all of that, there was another image too. A judge in a quiet room, a closed file beneath her hand, an old grandmother asking for one more Sunday. And a woman wise enough to know that in family court, the smallest request is sometimes carrying the whole weight of a life. If you believe Judge Judy's legacy is more than a courtroom show, subscribe to Beyond the Gavel for more untold chapters from the life, strength, and hidden heart of Judith Sheindlin.